For years to come, if there is one phrase that Pope Francis will be remembered for, is the line, "Who am I to judge?" No one will ever consider the context in which he said it, but all they will know is he said, "Who am I to judge?" A few months later, in one of his weekly audiences, he also said that being pious is much more than simply looking miserable in church. Being pious is clothing the naked, feeding the hungry, correcting the sinner. And as we know, among the works of mercy is correcting the sinner. And Jesus himself gives us a whole prescription, which we call the doctrine of fraternal correction, in which we correct one another and hopefully are open ourselves to being corrected as members of a community at large. And if we read the book of the prophet Ezekiel at the beginning and again halfway through, correcting and pointing out the sinner's ways is not only important, but the very salvation of our souls depends upon it. As Ezekiel is told, if you do not point the sinner's way to him, he will die for his sins, but I will hold you responsible for his death because you did not warn him. So what are we to make of the passage today in the gospel when Jesus says, "Stop judging and you will not be judged"? Perhaps the answer to that is found in the next line. "Stop condemning and you will not be condemned." You see, whenever someone comes to confession and confesses, "Father, I'm judgmental," the first question I ask them is, "Who have you condemned to hell?" And usually that's not what they mean. They mean that they're critical, either in their thinking or in their personal comment they made to someone. It may not necessarily be a sin because we're following Jesus' directions and we're actually engaged in a work of mercy. We're not, either mentally or otherwise, writing someone off as condemned to hell. We know that that is a judgment left to God alone. And that, in effect, is what Jesus is saying. Don't write people off as hopeless, as condemned. Don't take onto yourself a judgment reserved only to God. But Pope Francis, even today, expounded upon that when he said, when we are merciful, then we remember also our own sinfulness in the face of other people's sins, and we can act appropriately out of mercy to one another in that, because we're all called to look out for each other and help one another on that way to salvation. But perhaps the harshest part of today's gospel is when Jesus says, the measure with which you measure will be measured back to you. Well, how often do people simply say, well, I'm not going to say anything negative about anyone. I won't be critical of anyone for anything because I am not judgmental. I won't be judgmental. In many ways, when we consider the work of mercy, not the work of a horrendous busybody, but the work of mercy that we are called to in looking out for each other, what they're basically saying is, I'm not going to worry about anyone else. I'm only going to worry about myself. I'll leave them to their sinfulness. And what if God were to measure that back to us? He will leave us in our sinfulness. He will leave us to our sinfulness. We certainly don't want to be left alone by God in our sinfulness. We want God's mercy. We certainly should not take it upon ourselves to leave one another in our sinfulness, but engage in that work of mercy, which is correcting the sinner, calling one another back, not condemning them by leaving them to their sins, or condemning them by saying, well, they're hopeless and they're going to go to hell. It really is very much a fine line we must walk, because we are all in this together. So Jesus says, stop judging and you will not be judged. Stop condemning and you will not be condemned. Let's not take on a judgment that is reserved only to God, but take on the mercy that Jesus calls us to in today's gospel. And we've got a whole list of them, 14 of them, 7 spiritual works of mercy, 7 corporal works of mercy, and in that list, one of which still is, correct the sinner. We are not judging them. We are not condemning them. We are calling them back from their sinful ways, and we hope to be open to other people calling us back. We don't want to become a group of busybodies who mind everyone's business but our own, but rather a community of love and faith who walk with each other, work with each other, who are in this together, who call each other back from our sinful ways, and in doing so engage in the mercy that Jesus calls us to engage in, without engaging in the judgment of condemnation.